A closer look at the inescapable math of climate change. Debunking CBC's climate propaganda. Part 3 of 3. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society, and I'd like you to join me for this final section on a recent article that CBC published about the GHG inventory report and the new social cost of carbon calculation. So in it, we look at some of the math that CBC seems to gloss over or be unable to do, and show you the real math, the real costs. They're very burdensome, and many of the things that CBC claims would be easy to do would be virtually impossible to do in terms of getting to net zero. So let's have a look at what I found. So this is the report that I'm referring to, and they claim that the latest political skirmish over the carbon tax left out the most important facts. In fact, CBC left out most of the important facts. That's why we had to do a 3-part series to show you what they are. So, inescapable math, well, here's some more items on CBC's innumeracy. So Minister Guilbeault said that the bottom line is that Canada is bending the emissions curve downward, and this is a graph of our recent GHG inventory report. This looks like we're going upward again. You can't really count lockdown period, can you? That's not fair. Just to put this in context, Calgary's annual emissions are the equivalent of 20 days of the municipal emissions of Shanghai. So Calgary, of course, wants to spend $87 billion on a climate plan, and the government is already spending over $100 billion on climate plans. But in the meantime, while they're taxing you to death with a carbon tax, what's left unstated by CBC or the person they interviewed, Dale Begin, is the impact of 400,000 immigrants per year, each of them with a carbon footprint. Now, you may not know this, but Canada has a plan called the Century Initiative, and the objective is to up the population of Canada to 100 million people by 2100 through immigration. And this isn't a comment about immigrants or immigration, it's a comment about carbon footprints. You can't reach climate targets if you are bringing in hundreds of thousands of people every year. And Darshan Maharaja, who does a great blog, by the way, he did the math for us. If we were going to bring in all these people, adding another 63 million people would increase our CO2 emissions by 1.05 billion tons yearly. And he said, I'm not even going to go near the supply of housing and services. So of course, every immigrant that comes here needs housing, they need healthcare, they need transportation, and every one of them probably is coming from a warmer country. You know, most of the immigration to Canada people come from India, from China, from the Philippines. Those are the highest immigrant countries. And those are much warmer. So if you live there, you have a much smaller carbon footprint than you do in cold old Canada. Now, the Canadian Climate Institute claims that they are advancing education, conducting research on climate change, that they're producing and publishing educational materials. They want to increase the public's understanding of climate change. They want to protect and preserve the environment. And yet they want to push clean growth practices and policies. So let's look how clean growth is. Well, it turns out you need oil to go green. So this is a typical kind of mining machine, Liebherr 9800. It runs 2 engines. They're QSK 60s. Each of them are 2,000 horsepower. The engine burns 120 gallons per hour, or 2,800 gallons per 12-hour shift, or 2 million gallons per year. So you can't make green energy without a lot of diesel fuel. So if you want an education about mining and how not green it is, follow this man, John Lee Pettimore, on Twitter. And since the Canadian Climate Institute wants to educate people, it's funny that they're not educating people that renewables are expensive, unreliable, and environmentally destructive. You see this nice little rainbow and the turbines here in the CBC story? Well, yeah, this is what it looks like in Baotou, China. It's a wasteland. It's a toxic wasteland. People are dying there. There's no environmental regulations, and this is where the neodymium is mined for wind turbines. And wind turbines, when they do burst into flames, firefighters can't do much about it because the towers are so tall. And eagles and raptors are frequently murdered by these wind turbines. So that doesn't sound very environmentally friendly to me. Likewise, bats. And bats are very important for agriculture pest control. And it looks like Alberta's coal phase-out, which is touted in the article as being a great thing, was actually a waste of time and money, and it destabilized energy security for Alberta. It drives heat-or-eat poverty. So this is a quote from an Alberta power engineer. And he said the problem with wind is its randomness. Wind is completely uncorrelated with demand. If the Alberta government adds another 5,000 megawatts, then the total wind capacity would be 6,500 megawatts. Typically, this amount of wind would randomly experience 80% or higher ramps one or more times a week. That means it would be ramping up and down to very high output to very low. This would be the equivalent of ramping 6.5 Shepard natural gas plants from off to full to off again. These plants, and this is a combined cycle natural gas plant, are unable to do this over the long term. So they may end up having to put in simple cycle units instead, which from a CO2 perspective would pretty much defeat the purpose of adding wind, because the whole idea of adding wind is supposedly to reduce carbon dioxide. But it's never really been about reducing CO2. It's all about building wind, and now solar, with the new government statement about going 50% solar. So that was back in the day when the NDP government was bringing in the 30% renewables plan. And you can see what a bad plan that really is. It's also very, very expensive. Now, this is a report done by our professional engineering team. And just to give you a couple of bites here that, people often say, oh, well, we can use batteries to back up the wind and solar. The batteries needed to ensure a reliable supply of electricity from wind and solar generators in Alberta would cost almost $2 trillion. $2 trillion is almost 6 times Alberta's 2019 GDP of $353 billion. So for you to earn $2 trillion, you would have to earn $1 million a day for 5,476 years. So the upshot is the electricity bill would be $51,000 a year, an amount far beyond the ability of most Albertans to pay. No kidding. And this is another report by our professional engineering team. What you really need to know about renewable energy that the Pembina Institute won't tell you. It's imperative that we not base public policy decisions on the sort of hand-waving arguments and inept analyses contained in Renewable Energy and Baseload Myths, which is a report by Pembina. We cannot run a modern society on energy systems that depend to a large extent on the whims of the wind and the sun, no matter how much green energy zealots would like it to be otherwise. And so the conclusion is that dire social, economic, and perhaps even life consequences for Alberta families and businesses will result from these kind of renewables going green, clean tech policies. So CBC makes another fatuous and unsupported claim about the carbon tax. They claim what the PBO report leaves out, that it is simple and basically undisputed that one way or another Canada's emissions have to be reduced dramatically. The choice isn't between implementing a carbon tax or doing nothing. Even if it was, doing nothing would involve incredible costs. Well, they're wrong, because emissions growth will come from non-OECD countries. And you can see that here on this graph. The non-OECD countries have a big uptick in energy consumption, whereas the OECD countries, the developed nations, it's pretty much a flat line. So nothing that we do in Canada to cut emissions will do anything to affect climate change or global warming, because the non-OECD countries is where all the growth is. And also, the Parliamentary Budget Officer on November 8th, 2022, in a report showed there would be nominal economic impact if we do nothing. In a global context, we have to realize that North America and the European Union, we're only 15% of the world's population. These parts of the world are emerging nations, and they want to raise their people to the same level of comfort that we have. So Asia Pacific region is 60% of the world's population. Nothing we do will affect climate change. Global emissions have risen 60% since 1990. Population and economic growth in Asia is driving emissions growth. And, we're just such a tiny part of the world's population, and yet we're committing economic suicide with these green policies. And here's a bit more math. So this is a summary report done by Robert Lyman of a very comprehensive 1,000-page report done by Simon Michaud. And Simon Michaud wondered why no one had ever really done a full analysis of whether or not there's a material supply chain for us to get to net zero. So, he said in a video that I saw of him, he said, I've been in many boardroom meetings. We've got people making presentations saying, look how fabulous it'll be. This is my net zero plan. We're going to get there. And no one's ever asked the question, is there enough material now to meet the demands of net zero? And keep in mind that many of the world's developed nations are all trying to reach the same target at the same time. They're all trying to go to EVs. They're all trying to electrify the home heating. They're trying to expand their power grid, put in more wind and solar. All of these things need a lot of very specialized materials, critical minerals they're called. So Michaud did a very interesting thing. He simply looked at the global metal production in 2019 and extrapolated it to see, the total metal required to produce one generation of technology units to phase out fossil fuels. So we would need this amount of copper, tons of copper, and it would take us 189 years to mine it. Same for, say, lithium. It would take 9,920 years to mine it. Now, none of these mines are operational yet. So that's a problem because it takes about 16 years. It takes about 16 years to get a mine up and running. And you can't do overlapping processes because some of them have to be kind of linear. So you might know where there is a deposit. It might have been surveyed, but it has to be verified. And, there are very complex aspects to even securities law to make sure that you're not raising money on a false claim about a mine, like Bre-X, that big scandal. And then, they're probably in a remote location. May have to clear the forest, put in a road, put up power lines, or build a power plant on site, order the equipment. You saw that big digger earlier. I don't think those things are just off the shelf. I think you probably have to order them quite far in advance. Then you have to arrange for hiring. get all the environmental regulations reviewed and get your environmental impact study done and approved. So it will take longer than 2030 just to get a mine up and running. And we're talking about dozens, if not hundreds of mines to try and fulfill this. So as you see, it's no one ever thought of this very important part. No due diligence was done. So CBC is wrong again. CBC says the only responsible choice is between putting a price on carbon or doing something else to reduce those emissions. And that something else inevitably would have some cost as well. Most economists have concluded that putting a price on carbon is the most efficient and least costly way to drive emissions reductions. Well, Robert Lyman explains why CBC is wrong. Via email, he noted that today we have well over 400 different climate policy measures in place, and it's actually an uncountable number, and there's no inventory that includes all federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal measures. There's a vast collection of overlapping, duplicating, and sometimes contradictory measures. So regulations, codes, zoning, regulatory review processes, subsidies, taxes, tax exemptions, tradable permits, propaganda, moral suasion, the list goes on and grows every year. No one knows the marginal effects or the cost effectiveness of any one measure, and no one in government really cares because we're saving the planet. Except, of course, that nothing Canada does, including ceasing to exist, will have any measurable effect on global temperatures or climate. So it's all theater and virtue signaling, public policy gone insane. And this is a very comprehensive report that Robert Lyman wrote in 2019. So a few of the elements have changed in there, but it shows how crazy the carbon taxation situation is in Canada. And CBC is wrong again because they say, but regardless, it would be a mistake to assess the federal carbon tax in a vacuum because Canada does not exist in a vacuum. Well, effectively, we are in a vacuum if you look at China and their emissions. So Canada as an emitter would be down here very close to this bottom line. So yeah, if we disappeared, it wouldn't matter. So you've got to be joking because CBC says even if getting down to 670 megatons is a good start, it's also a reminder of how far Canada still needs to go. And while politicians haggling over the details of policy is inevitable, the math of climate change is unavoidable. Yeah, well, we've been showing you the math all the way through here. And just to give you an idea, here's a grid with 10,000 little squares, and here are the 4 parts of CO2 in the atmosphere. So you might like to have a look at this plain language report that the late Dick Tonis did. He was a professor emeritus of chemical engineering from Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands. It's quite good, I think. And just remember that even a global lockdown for 2 years did not reduce CO2 increase in the atmosphere. Now, you will say to me, as I say that, but wait a minute, we did see a drop in the graph for Canada. That's just measuring Canada's emissions. That's not measuring global emissions of carbon dioxide because Mother Nature is putting out a lot of carbon dioxide. And it turns out even locking down the economy for 2 years did not drop the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. So ironically, it looks like ever since the Paris Agreement, someone had been planning this. The only way that a 2015 agreement can achieve a 2-degree goal is to shut down the whole global economy. Well, he said that in 2015. But in fact, the fact is the drop in emissions during COVID lockdowns is not enough to significantly affect the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And you can go to this link. There's a graph from Dr. Roy Spencer. It shows that the annual random fluctuations of the change of CO2 concentration are far larger than the expected change due to lockdown reduction changes of emissions. So the expected reduction in the annual CO2 increase in the atmosphere is only 0.12 parts per million, 12/100th parts per million, due to the COVID lockdown in 2020. But the annual fluctuation is 0.5 to 1.0 parts per million, or 5/10 to 1 part per million. Therefore, the CO2 change in the atmosphere due to the COVID lockdown is far smaller than random fluctuations. And this just in, ironically, this was posted, I think today, today or yesterday. Federal government does not know the extent to which greenhouse gas regulations are reducing emissions, which is exactly what Robert Lyman said too. So we're doing all these things and nobody knows if anything's effective. Then there's the claim that climate money rebates are more than what you pay in carbon tax. So CBC says in a report released last month, the PBO assessed both fiscal and economic impact of the federal carbon tax and climate action incentive rebates that return the proceeds of the tax to households. In fiscal terms, the PBO confirmed that for the vast majority of households, the amount they receive through the rebate is more than the direct costs of the tax, confirming the Liberal government's central claim about the policy. But then they go on to say, but the PBO also found that the tax would act as a drag on the Canadian economy, and the economic costs exceed the fiscal benefits for most households. You see, that should be the headline story, that the carbon tax is actually destroying our economy, that it's a drag on our economy, that even though a few people get a fiscal benefit, most people never catch up with the costs of the carbon tax and all these other measures that Robert Lyman has mentioned that I just read you. These are crushing our economy, and as you've seen, we're only 5% of North America is only 5% of the world's population. So we are committing economic suicide for no reason. We're not saving the planet in any way. And Robert Lyman did a report some years ago, 2019, and we were talking here about just transportation. And the point here is that you can carbon tax people all you want, but it's inelastic. It's that when the price goes up, consumer buying habits stay about the same. And when the price goes down, consumers' buying habits also remain unchanged. And the reason is that if you need to drive to work, you need to drive to work. So you're going to have to fill up your car. And he notes in this report that after 5 decades of governmental efforts to discourage commuting by personal vehicle, the percentage of working Canadians commuting by car has fallen from 80.7 to 79.5%. In other words, regardless of what government planners, transit commissions, and environmentalists may prefer, the average citizen is voting for personal vehicles. And that's, I think that's quite telling. 5 decades, and there's almost no change. But even if we look at William Nordhaus, who is the golden boy of climate economics, we find that even in his calculations, we should do nothing but adapt. So this is a review by Robert Murphy. And William Nordhaus, of course, won the Nobel Prize for his work on climate change, and you'd think that his model would support the UN's goal of limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but he found that it would make humanity $14 trillion poorer compared to doing nothing at all about climate change. And moreover, the 14 trillion magnitude of the net damages from the wrong policy, including what's now the UN's goal, would dwarf the 1.07 trillion size of the net benefits from even the best theoretically possible policy. Can you believe that? And it's important to note that the 1.5 degree Celsius target is political. It's not scientific, and that's written up in this report. You can see it here. These are political goals and not scientific ones. So when people are saying, oh, we're working with the best science and we have to meet this goal. No, we don't have to meet this goal. It's not scientific. And it would cost us trillions of dollars for nothing. So now for the good news, because there is good news. The climate emergency is over. We do have time. How can I say that? Well, these scenarios have been proliferated as if business as usual, but in fact they're implausible scenarios. And if we take them off the graph, you can see that there is no climate emergency. So Roger Pielke Jr. has done lots and lots of work on this particular topic, and he's got some plain language explainers on his blog and his Substack. He's got peer-reviewed papers out there. There's a number of video interviews with him. So that's really great news. We actually don't have to do any of these crazy things that people are proposing. And people have known for a long time that carbon dioxide is not a control knob that can fine-tune climate. It does have some warming effect. It's negligible. And here's how negligible it is. Here's some more math. This is from Professor William van Wijngaarden. You can see that Canada's contribution to warming over the past century is 0.019 degrees Celsius, and Alberta's is 0.006. So that's 6/1000ths of a degree. It's immeasurable. It's not even worth talking about. And this is from Dr. Soon's presentation, and he shows that he's 100% confident that it's impossible to find CO2 warming in Canadian records. And you can see that we're actually warming a bit in winter, but that's not caused by CO2. And of course, with a 50 degrees Celsius seasonal range in Canada's temperature, you'd think a little bit of warming in winter might be good for us. So there's no need to divide society with dangerous dreams of climate ideologues. Energy is life. Energy illiteracy and climate policies are destroying Canada and creating the global energy crisis, famine, and widespread heat or eat poverty. So we really have to stop this, people. We need to make a big U-turn. So help us educate Canadians. Help us educate the world. You can join as a member, you can donate, you can sponsor, you can share our material. You can donate or join over here on our website, or you can donate by e-transfer to contact@Friends of Science Society. So just a reminder, CBC gets about $1.4 billion in taxpayers' money every year, and they can't do the math on climate change. And we operate on about $150,000 a year from our loyal members and helpful donors. Thank you so much, everyone. So if you can help top that up, that would be great. If you can support us, if you can share our material, if you can take our material to the people who need to hear about it. And if you can calm your friends and family down, show them that there's no climate emergency. Scientists have made a mistake. They've been using the RCP 8.5 and RCP 6 as if business as usual when they're both implausible. So the climate emergency is over. We do have time, and we have to make a big U-turn on these policies before Canada is destroyed and before people's lives are ruined. No one will be able to survive with a $265 a ton carbon tax. No one. So that doesn't sound like peace, order, and good government to me. It sounds like bad government, no due diligence, and too much influence from green crony capitalists and rent seekers. So that's my little rant for the day. That's the end of part 3. Thanks very much for tuning in. Hope you can support us. Please share our stuff and put some comments down below. We try to look at them and, respond if people have questions. We'll post this on our blog. All 3 parts will be posted on the blog with the PowerPoint. Then you can go through and click on the links and get more information. So thanks very much for watching. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.